Welcome to our second podcast in the Guilty Parent Club series, where we're going to be delving into some lovely psychological science. In our first podcast, we introduced the ideas behind the Guilty Parent Club and the 6P key framework, and how it can help us break out of the cycles of stress, reactivity, guilt, and self-doubt that we can find ourselves in as parents. We learnt that each P key will provide strategies for us as parents to help manage our emotional regulation, as well as parenting techniques that actually work with our kids, because we need both. But before we get on to understanding more about each P key, what they mean and how they help us, in this podcast we're going to understand more about why they're there in the first place. And I don't know about you, but I think it's incredibly important to understand why we do things as parents and why certain approaches make sense. In this podcast, we're going to be covering some of the most important information that we can know as parents. So get ready. And if you haven't yet downloaded the workbook that goes along with this Guilty Parent Club series, you might want to do that now. Jump over to the show notes and you'll find the link. Let's first set the scene. So just imagine your child has done something or isn't doing something that we do or we don't want them to do. We've tried all the strategies we've read about, but we're not really feeling sure about what we're doing or if we're handling it right. We're second-guessing ourselves, and our children are still not playing ball. Everyone is getting progressively more stressed. We're at the end of our tether, and we get triggered. Our emotions can seem to go from 0 to 100, and we react, probably in ways that we don't want to. It doesn't help us get the thing done with our child, and then, of course, we beat ourselves up about it and feel guilty afterwards. We tell ourselves all sorts of things about what a bad parent we are, how we're going to mess up our kids, and goodness knows what else. We worry things will never change, which only makes us more stressed. And the next time it happens, all of this doubt, guilt, and stress feeds into our reaction again. This all sounds familiar, doesn't it? We can get stuck in this internal cycle of stress and guilt after something goes awry with our kids, but it's also fed by a number of external factors that make it even harder for us to feel regulated and confident as a parent. We're lacking in support, we're lacking in sleep, our physical health is on the back burner, we're overwhelmed with demands. Our basic needs aren't being met. We also struggle to find the time for ourselves, time and space to connect with others, to do things we enjoy, maybe to find a way to develop a new sense of identity since we've become a parent. Maybe we're creating unrealistic expectations of ourselves as parents, and we're comparing ourselves negatively to others. Perhaps we're also trying to change childhood patterns from our own experience, but often feel like we're failing. Take a look at the file in the show notes to see this cycle represented visually. We've got to tackle these cycles and tackle our brain regulation from multiple different angles. It's not a simple fix, but it is possible, and that's exactly what the 6P keys do. We're going to find out more about how they do this in later podcasts, but for now, we're going to do a deeper dive into the brain science to understand more why it's so important, not only because it will help you understand how the 6P keys work, but because it can help us be more understanding of ourselves and of our child. To know that it's not just you, and it's not your fault that your brain works this way. It's just about being human. So let's start off by thinking about how our brains and our bodies respond when we feel stressed, angry, anxious, guilty, or ashamed. When we're feeling emotionally calm and in control and thinking rationally, our prefrontal cortex is in charge. This is a relatively new part of the brain from an evolutionary sense, and it's housed just under your forehead. This is the area that controls conscious thought and complex actions, such as being able to plan and predict different outcomes, to inhibit impulses, and to initiate actions, to focus attention, avoid distractions, think logically, consider other people's perspectives, organise, problem solve. These are called executive functions. Because it's like having a little executive in your brain, managing things and integrating information from other parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex can influence other brain areas, including the limbic system, which is our emotional brain. So it has a really significant role in regulating our emotions and our behaviour. And when our prefrontal cortex is in charge, when it's online, we can think of our brain and our body as being regulated. On the other hand, when things get stressful with our kids, maybe when they're not doing what we need them to do or when they're showing big emotions, our brains see this as a threat. And the limbic system, that's our emotional brain, activates what's known as our sympathetic nervous system. It sends our body and our brain into the fight, flight, freeze response, which I'm sure you've heard about. We can also call this threat mode. And the amygdala is a key player in this process. It's a walnut-shaped bit of brain right in the middle, and it's a very old part of the brain evolutionarily. It acts as our threat alarm, and so when our threat mode is switched on, our prefrontal cortex is switched off. It doesn't go offline completely, but it's not as effective as usual. This is so that our brain and our body can work in an automatic way to keep us safe. It does mean that we can't think clearly because we're reacting automatically. For example, it takes less than 2/100ths of a second for our threat mode to activate when it senses a threat, which is a whole lot quicker than we can access conscious thought processes operated by the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala operates on a better safe than sorry basis, which means that it can be triggered at even the slightest sign of danger. And clearly, this is really useful when we or our kids are actually in danger, like if our child runs into the road. But it's less useful if threat mode gets triggered by our children when we're not in an emergency situation, because it means that we simply can't parent in the way that we're planning to, because we can't think straight. We're just reacting emotionally and impulsively, and when we end up in this state, when our threat mode has been triggered with our children, it can look like anger, frustration. You might see shouting, snapping, saying things we don't mean, maybe making threats or dishing out punishments. It could look like panic and anxiety, or maybe even going blank or to run away. It could even look like crying, or freezing, shutting down, feeling numb, going blank. And when we're in threat mode, we might find ourselves reacting like our parents used to, because those are the more automatic pathways that have been hardwired into our brain and don't require conscious thought. We explore this a lot more in the parent predictability key. So when we're in threat mode, we can think of ourselves as being dysregulated, because the regulating part of our brain is switched off. And that's why we often know the right thing to do in those moments, but we just can't act on it because our emotions get in the way. It's not our fault that our threat mode gets triggered by parenting and by our children. That's the way our brains work in response to witnessing distress or feeling out of control. On top of this, it's useful to know that when we become parents, the structure of our brain literally changes. Activity increases in our amygdala, as well as in areas responsible for empathy, social connection, and, yes, guilt. So our very brain wiring changes when we have a child, making us more emotionally sensitive. Of course, our children's threat mode works in basically the same way as ours. When they are dysregulated, their thinking brain goes offline too, which means they're even less able to listen to us, process what's happening, and respond in what we would consider a logical way. There are other aspects of their brain development that impact on this process, but keeping in mind our children's brain regulation as well as our own is really important in these moments. And so all of these factors mean that at stressful moments it's common for us to get into a vicious cycle of dysregulation with our child the more their dysregulation feeds our dysregulation, the more our dysregulation feeds theirs, and so on. And then, of course, we feel guilty about how we acted in those moments and the impact we might imagine it's having on our children. We might feel quite disturbed by our reaction, especially if we don't think of ourselves as an angry or an impatient person, or if we think we should be more grateful for our children, for example. Why are we reacting this way? And we vow to be different tomorrow, but the same thing happens again the next day and we beat ourselves up about it again. But guess what? This self-criticism can be perceived by our brain as another threat, which makes things even worse. That's right, threat mode can actually be activated not just by a real stressful event, but by our own thoughts. And this is because our threat system, in the old part of the brain, doesn't know about the existence of our newer brain, our thinking brain. And it doesn't realize that our thoughts aren't real threats. So when we're criticizing ourselves for our parenting, we're likely to tip over into threat mode much more quickly. And this is why criticizing ourselves when things don't go to plan makes us less like the parent we want to be, rather than more. For more information about this, check out the workbook that you can access via the show notes. So, does this mean we shouldn't feel bad when we get things wrong with our kids? Well, that's a tricky question that we're going to explore more in our next podcast. I hope you can join me to understand more about the difference between parental guilt and parental shame, and the impact that these things can have on us as parents, on our mental health, but also on our parenting. We've covered so much important information in this podcast. So if you want to go back to the beginning and listen to it again to make sure you haven't missed any of the key points, please do that. But otherwise, I'll see you in the next podcast. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. We explored the fascinating ways our brains work and how understanding this can really make a difference in how we understand and handle parenting challenges. If this episode resonated for you, I would love you to join us in the Guilty Parent Club. As a member of the club, you'll gain access to exclusive private podcasts and workbooks providing deeper dives into these topics, taking you step by step through the 6P key framework, and they're packed with practical tools that you can apply straight away. For more details, head over to drjoethepsychologist.com/Guilty Parent Club. See you there.